The crisp November air buzzed with quiet energy as the driver eased his car through the narrow checkpoint of a local street. It was supposed to be an ordinary drive home, a detour after a long day, nothing out of the ordinary. But ordinary days have a way of twisting into nightmares when prejudice fuels the fire. "Step out of the car," a sharp voice barked, cutting through the silence like a blade. Confused, the man looked up to see the glare of a flashlight and the towering figure of a uniformed police officer. The demand wasn't a question, it was a command wrapped in suspicion. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, trying to understand what had turned his simple drive into an interrogation. The officer's sneer was the first answer, dripping with disdain. "Don't play smart with me. A car like this doesn't belong to someone like you." Those words hit like a punch to the gut, heavy with the weight of assumptions. But the man stayed composed. Years of dealing with this kind of treatment had taught him that silence often spoke louder than anger. He kept his hands visible, careful not to make any sudden moves. "I'm asking again," he said quietly. "What seems to be the issue, officer?" The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. His hand hovered near his holster as though the man in front of him posed some immediate threat. The scene began to draw attention, a few passers-by slowed their pace, unsure whether to intervene or keep walking. "You think you can just drive around like this?" the officer snapped, his voice rising. "You're in a neighborhood you don't belong in a car that looks stolen. And you're questioning me?" The man's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I live nearby. My car isn't stolen." The officer smirked, his disbelief obvious. "Then prove it." Reaching slowly into his pocket, the man retrieved his wallet and offered his identification. But instead of accepting it, the officer slapped it out of his hand. The gesture wasn't just unnecessary, it was humiliating. "Get on your knees," the officer shouted, his tone dripping with authority abused. "I'm done playing games." There was a flicker in the man's eyes, a glimmer of resistance he couldn't suppress any longer. "On my knees? For what? I haven't done anything wrong." That was when the officer made his move. Without warning, he shoved the man against the car and kicked the back of his leg, forcing him down. The impact was sharp, and the humiliation sharper. Gasps rippled through the small crowd gathering at a distance. "Stay down," the officer growled. "Know your place." For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The man, now on the ground, looked up at his aggressor with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating. There was a quiet power in his gaze that the officer hadn't noticed yet, too drunk on his own arrogance to realize the mistake he had just made. The man slowly pushed himself off the ground, brushing off the dirt from his clothes. His voice, steady but laced with steel, cut through the tension. "You've got no idea who I am, do you?" The officer blinked, taken aback by the shift in demeanor. "I don't care who you are," he scoffed. "You're just another, stop." The man raised a hand, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "You've said enough." The crowd grew larger, their murmurs growing louder. Something was shifting. The officer, suddenly unsure of his position, began glancing nervously at the people around him. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. "Run the plates," the man said evenly, gesturing to his car. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, but his radio crackled to life as dispatch responded to the request. And then, everything changed. The voice on the other end of the line was sharp and professional. "That vehicle belongs to the sheriff of the county." "Confirmed." "Repeat, that is the sheriff's car." The color drained from the officer's face. His bravado faltered, replaced by the dawning realization of his colossal error. He took a step back, his hand dropping away from his belt. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, trying to process what he'd just heard. The man, no longer just a man, but the sheriff himself, took a step forward, his presence suddenly towering over the officer. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Silence fell over the scene. The crowd was now fully engrossed, their whispers carrying a mixture of shock and outrage. The officer's humiliation was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But the sheriff wasn't done. His next words were calm, deliberate, and devastating. "You think you're untouchable because you wear that badge? You think you can treat people however you want without consequences? Let me make this clear, you're about to find out exactly how wrong you are." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was frozen, caught between his collapsing ego and the weight of the truth staring him in the face. As the sheriff turned to address the crowd, his voice carried a sense of justice that resonated with everyone present. "No one," he said, "is above accountability. Not even someone who wears a uniform." The officer stood there, paralyzed, as the sheriff walked away, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken consequences. What happened next shocked everyone involved. What became of the officer, and how the sheriff chose to handle the situation, was something no one could have predicted. Would justice truly be served, or would the system protect its own? Stay tuned to find out. At Plough of Twist, we firmly stand against any form of racism or discrimination. This is a space where stories challenge biases, inspire change, and celebrate equality. To our Black audience members, your voices, experiences, and stories matter deeply. Thank you for being here with us as we share narratives that uplift and empower. We hope you enjoy this compelling story, filled with powerful moments and lessons that resonate. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content. Now, let's dive into the story. The small town of Milbrook was a place where time seemed to move slower, yet tension simmered beneath the surface like a pot ready to boil over. Nestled in a quiet county, the town boasted a close-knit community that prided itself on its traditions and law enforcement. For decades, the Milbrook Police Department operated as a cornerstone of the town's identity, a symbol of order and control. But beneath the polished badge of authority, there lay an ugly truth, deep-seated prejudice that often determined who was protected and who was targeted. At the heart of this story is Jordan Hayes, the newly appointed sheriff. Jordan, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, carried himself with quiet confidence. His voice was measured, his words deliberate, and his presence undeniable. Jordan had worked his way up through the ranks, earning his position not through favoritism or connections but through relentless dedication and an unshakable belief in justice. Born and raised in Milbrook, Jordan knew the town's dynamics better than most. As a young black man, he had seen both the beauty and the ugliness of his hometown. Growing up, his family was one of the few black families in the area, and while they were respected by many, they also faced subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, forms of racism. Jordan's father, a schoolteacher, had always told him, "You can't let them define you. Let your actions speak louder than their words." Those lessons shaped the man Jordan became. Despite the challenges, Jordan loved Milbrook. He believed in its potential, in its people, and in the possibility of change. When he first joined the police force, he was met with skepticism and hostility from some of his peers. But Jordan didn't back down. Over the years, he earned the respect of many through his unwavering fairness and an ability to de-escalate even the most volatile situations. He had a way of making people feel seen and heard, regardless of their background. However, not everyone was thrilled about Jordan's rise to power. Officer Brent Callahan, a veteran of the Milbrook Police Department, was one of them. Brent, in his mid-50s, was the epitome of old-school policing. With his barrel chest, gruff demeanor, and an almost permanent scowl etched into his face, Brent exuded an air of authority that he wielded like a weapon. To Brent, the badge wasn't just a symbol of law, it was a symbol of dominance. Brent had spent over 2 decades on the force, building a reputation as a no-nonsense officer who did what needed to be done. But beneath his stern exterior lay a man fueled by deep-seated biases. Brent believed in a clear social order, and in his mind, Jordan's success challenged that order. To Brent, Jordan was a threat, not because of his competence, but because of what he represented: change. The day Jordan was sworn in as sheriff was a turning point for Milbrook. Many in the community celebrated, seeing Jordan as a beacon of progress. But for Brent, it was a bitter pill to swallow. He masked his resentment with a veneer of professionalism, but it was clear to anyone paying attention that Brent's respect for Jordan was paper-thin. Jordan, ever perceptive, was aware of Brent's hostility. He had dealt with men like Brent before, men who saw his success as an affront to their own sense of superiority. But Jordan refused to let it deter him. He focused on his work, building trust within the community and leading by example. One of Jordan's favorite things to do was patrol the town incognito, blending in with the community to better understand their needs. He often drove his personal car, a sleek black sedan, rather than the department-issued vehicle. To him, these drives were a way to stay grounded, to remind himself of the people he served. On one such evening, Jordan found himself driving through a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The sun had just set, and the streets were quiet save for the occasional passerby. It was a peaceful moment, a brief respite from the pressures of his role. Little did he know, that peace was about to be shattered. Brent was on patrol that night, cruising through the same neighborhood. When he spotted the black sedan, his instincts kicked in. To Brent, the car didn't belong. It was too polished, too out of place in this part of town. Without a second thought, he flicked on his lights and pulled the car over. Jordan sighed as the red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. He knew the drill. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped, and it likely wouldn't be the last. He pulled over to the side of the road, his movements calm and deliberate. He had nothing to hide, but he knew all too well how easily these situations could escalate. Brent approached the car, his hand resting on his holster. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with pleasantries. Jordan rolled down his window and handed over his documents without a word. Brent barely glanced at them before launching into his accusations. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? This your car, or did you borrow it from someone who could actually afford it?" The insinuation was clear, and it hit Jordan like a slap. But he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he said calmly, "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Brent leaned closer, his face twisted into a sneer. "The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can drive around here like you own the place. Step out of the car." Jordan's jaw tightened. He wasn't just angry, he was disappointed. Disappointed that, even after all these years, men like Brent still wielded their prejudice like a weapon. But Jordan knew he had to tread carefully. He stepped out of the car, his hands visible. "Turn around," Brent ordered. "Hands on the hood." Jordan hesitated. "Brent," he said quietly, "you don't want to do this." The use of his name stopped Brent in his tracks, but only for a moment. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," Brent snapped. What happened next would set the stage for a reckoning that Milbrook would never forget. Jordan's calm exterior masked a storm brewing within, a storm that would soon shake the very foundation of the town. The silence in the air was almost unbearable as Brent's words hung there, heavy and unchallenged. Jordan stood still, his hands resting against the hood of the car as the officer circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam traced over his shoulders, his back, the side of his face. It wasn't just an inspection, it was an exercise in dominance, and everyone around could see it. A small crowd had begun to gather. Some stood at a distance, hesitant to intervene, while others whispered to one another, their faces tense with a mix of concern and fear. This was Milbrook, after all, a town where speaking out could just as easily land you in trouble as it could make you a hero. "Is this really necessary?" Jordan's voice was steady but firm, the kind of tone that demanded answers without raising its volume. He wasn't pleading, he never would. Instead, his words carried a quiet authority that seemed to make Brent hesitate. if only for a moment. Brent stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. He lowered his voice, leaning in as if to make sure no one else could hear. You think you can just talk your way out of this? I know your type, always trying to act like you're better than the rest of us. Newsflash, that badge doesn't make you untouchable. Jordan turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Brent's gaze. The badge doesn't make me better, he replied calmly. But it does make me accountable. Does it make you? The words hit Brent like a slap, and for a moment, his composure cracked. His hand instinctively moved to his belt, fingers brushing the handle of his baton, but he stopped himself. The crowd was watching now, their murmurs growing louder. Phones were out, some recording, others held discreetly at their sides. Is everything okay here? A voice called out. It was a young woman, no older than her mid-20s, standing just beyond the edge of the scene. Her tone was cautious but firm, her expression a mixture of concern and defiance. Brent turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. This is police business. Step back. The woman didn't budge. It doesn't look like business. It looks like harassment. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd, emboldened by her courage. Brent's jaw tightened, and he took a step toward her, his presence looming. I said step back. Unless you want to spend the night in a cell. Jordan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. That's enough, Brent. The officer froze, his back stiffening as he turned to face Jordan again. There was something in the sheriff's tone, something unshakable, that sent a chill down Brent's spine. For a moment, the balance of power seemed to shift. But Brent wasn't done. Not yet. He couldn't back down now, not in front of this crowd, not after he'd gone this far. You don't get to tell me what's enough, he spat, his voice low and venomous. You're not in charge here. Jordan straightened, his hands falling to his sides. His movements were deliberate, measured, and when he spoke again, his words carried a weight that silenced the crowd. I am in charge, Brent. And you're dangerously close to crossing a line you can't come back from. Brent faltered, the authority in Jordan's voice cutting through his bravado like a scalpel. But his pride wouldn't let him back down entirely. He stepped back, his lips curling into a sneer. We'll see about that. The tension lingered in the air as Brent returned to his patrol car, radioing in what he claimed was a routine stop. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their curiosity and unease leaving behind an undercurrent of tension that wouldn't soon be forgotten. Jordan stood by his car for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers who lingered nearby. He nodded to the young woman who had spoken up, a silent gesture of gratitude, before sliding back into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and as he pulled away, his mind was already racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Jordan was in his office, reviewing reports and sipping his coffee when his deputy, Marcus, knocked on the door. Marcus was one of the few officers Jordan trusted implicitly, a man of integrity who had served alongside him for years. You've got to see this, Marcus said, stepping inside with his phone in hand. He placed it on the desk and hit play. The video from the night before filled the screen, capturing Brent's actions in stark detail. The confrontation, the humiliation, the crowd, it was all there. Jordan watched in silence, his jaw tightening with each passing second. By the time the video ended, his hands were clenched into fists. It's already making rounds online, Marcus said quietly. The community's not happy. People are calling for Brent's suspension. Jordan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He wasn't surprised, but that didn't make the situation any easier. This wasn't just about Brent anymore, it was about the department, the community, and the systemic issues that had been festering for years. We need to handle this carefully, Jordan said finally. If we don't, it's going to tear the town apart. Marcus nodded. What's the plan? Jordan sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. I'll deal with Brent directly. But first, We need to address the community. If we don't acknowledge what happened, we lose their trust. Later that afternoon, Jordan stood before a gathering of community members at the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. He addressed the crowd with his usual calm demeanor, acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. But Brent wasn't having it. Watching from the back of the room, his anger simmered beneath the surface. He felt cornered, betrayed, and his resentment toward Jordan grew with every word the sheriff spoke. As the meeting ended and the crowd began to disperse, Brent approached Jordan, his voice low and threatening. "You think you can hang me out to dry? You're making a mistake, Hayes. A big one." Jordan didn't flinch. "The only mistake here is thinking you're above accountability." Their confrontation was brief, but it set the stage for what was to come, a storm that would shake Milbrook to its core. Brent's defiance wasn't just about ego, it was about survival. And as the tension between the two men escalated, the line between right and wrong began to blur, leaving everyone wondering how far Brent was willing to go, and whether Jordan could stop him before it was too late. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights in the station felt oppressive. Jordan sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the reports in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The tension with Brent was reaching a breaking point, and the events of the last few days had turned the usually steady rhythm of his department into a storm of whispers, uncertainty, and simmering anger. "Sheriff," Marcus's voice broke through the haze as he stepped into the office. He closed the door behind him, his expression tense. "You need to see this." Marcus handed over a file, and Jordan opened it slowly. Inside were transcripts of complaints, anonymous, dated, detailed. They painted a picture of Brent's long history of misconduct, intimidation, excessive force, racial profiling. The weight of it settled heavily on Jordan's shoulders. "This isn't just about what happened the other night," Marcus said, his tone low but urgent. "This goes deeper. People are scared to speak up, but it's all starting to come out now." Jordan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Why didn't this come to me sooner?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. "Because they didn't trust the system. But now, after what happened, they trust you." The gravity of those words wasn't lost on Jordan. He had worked his entire career to build that trust, and now it was being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Where's Brent?" Jordan asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "In the locker room," Marcus replied. "He's been on edge all morning." Jordan nodded, rising from his chair. "It's time we have a conversation." The walk to the locker room felt longer than usual, every step heavy with purpose. As Jordan pushed the door open, the metallic clang of a locker echoed through the room. Brent stood at the far end, his back turned, slamming a locker shut with more force than necessary. "Brent," Jordan called, his voice even but firm. Brent turned slowly, his face a mask of thinly veiled resentment. "What do you want, Hayes?" "We need to talk," Jordan said, stepping closer. "In private." Brent let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms. "What's there to talk about? You've already made up your mind about me." Jordan stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. "This isn't about what I think. It's about your actions. And the people you've hurt." Brent's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "You've got a lot of nerve, standing there like you're some kind of saint. You think you're better than me? You think you're going to save this town by tearing me down?" "This isn't about me," Jordan replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "It's about accountability. You've crossed lines, Brent. Lines that can't be ignored." Brent's laughter was sharp and humorless. "Accountability? Don't lecture me about accountability, Hayes. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. You don't know what it's like out there." "I know exactly what it's like," Jordan said, stepping closer. "I've lived it. And that's why I won't let you use that badge to justify your behavior." Brent's jaw clenched, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then he took a step forward, his voice lowering into a growl. "You think you're the hero in this story, don't you? But let me tell you something, Hayes, heroes don't last in this town. People like me, we're the ones who keep the peace." Jordan didn't flinch. He met Brent's gaze head-on, his voice steady. "You're not keeping the peace, Brent. You're keeping control. And there's a difference." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. For a moment, Brent looked as though he might say something else, but then the door to the locker room swung open. Marcus stepped inside, his face pale. "Sheriff," he said, his voice urgent. "You need to come out here. Now." Jordan turned to him, his brow furrowing. "What's going on?" Marcus glanced at Brent, then back at Jordan. "It's about the video. Someone's here to talk about it." Jordan didn't need to ask who. He nodded, motioning for Marcus to lead the way. Brent followed reluctantly, his presence a dark cloud looming behind them. The station's lobby was filled with tension as a man in a suit stood waiting. He was tall and sharp-eyed, his expression unreadable. In his hand, he held a tablet, the screen displaying a paused video, the video. "Sheriff Hayes," the man said, extending a hand. "Detective Logan. Internal Affairs." Jordan shook his hand, his jaw tightening. "Detective. I assume you're here about the recent incident." Logan nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to Brent before settling back on Jordan. "I am. And I'm here to investigate allegations of misconduct within your department." Jordan's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show. "I see. What do you need from me?" "For now," Logan said, his voice cool and professional, full transparency. "I'll be reviewing all records, interviewing personnel, and speaking with community members. I trust you'll cooperate." Jordan nodded. "Of course." Logan's gaze shifted to Brent, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Officer Callahan, I'll be speaking with you shortly." Brent's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He said nothing, but the tension in his body was palpable. As Logan turned to leave, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Jordan glanced at Brent, whose anger was now simmering just below the surface. "This isn't over," Brent muttered, his voice barely audible. Jordan sighed, his voice low but firm. "No, Brent. It's just beginning." The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews and questions. Logan moved through the station like a shadow, gathering information and speaking with anyone who would talk. By the time evening fell, the weight of the investigation was pressing down on everyone. Jordan sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The tension was unbearable, but he knew there was no turning back now. The truth was coming to light, and with it, the promise of change. What that change would look like, however, remained uncertain. And as the hours ticked by, one question loomed larger than any other: how far would Brent go to protect himself, and what would it cost everyone else? The office was dark except for the faint glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across Jordan's face. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day pressing against him like a storm cloud about to burst. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp knock at the door. Marcus stepped in, his face tense. "You're not going to like this," Marcus said, his voice low as he shut the door behind him. He handed over a folded piece of paper. "Logan found something. It's not good." Jordan unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the words. It was an anonymous tip, detailed, damning. It alleged that Brent had not only falsified reports but actively engaged in intimidation to silence community members who had tried to file complaints against him. Jordan's stomach churned as he read the list of incidents, each one worse than the last. "He's cornered," Marcus said quietly, sitting across from him. "And he knows it. That makes him dangerous." Jordan nodded, his jaw tightening. We've got to handle this carefully. If he feels like he has nothing to lose, Marcus didn't need him to finish the sentence. You want me to pull his badge? Not yet, Jordan said, his voice firm. We do this by the book. No missteps. Just as Marcus was about to respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the station's hallway. Both men shot to their feet. Jordan reached the door first, stepping into the corridor to find Brent in a heated argument with Logan. You're out of line. Brent barked, his face red with anger. Logan, calm and composed, stood his ground. I'm just doing my job, Officer Callahan. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to worry about. Brent took a step closer, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. Don't talk to me like I'm some kind of criminal. I've given my life to this job. Jordan intervened, stepping between the two men. That's enough, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He turned to Brent. In my office. Now. Brent hesitated, his chest heaving with barely contained fury, but he didn't argue. He stormed past Jordan into the office, slamming the door behind him. Logan started to follow, but Jordan held up a hand. I'll handle this, Jordan said firmly. Logan nodded but didn't look convinced. When Jordan entered the office, Brent was pacing like a caged animal. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations. You've got something to say to me, Sheriff? Brent spat, his tone dripping with defiance. Jordan closed the door, leaning against it as he crossed his arms. I think it's time we stop dancing around the truth. You've been abusing your position, Brent, and it ends now. Brent laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Abusing my position? That's rich coming from you. You've been gunning for me since the day you took that badge. This isn't about me, Jordan said, his voice steady. This is about the people you've hurt, the trust you've broken. It's over, Brent. The evidence is there, and you know it. Brent stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing as he pointed a finger at Jordan. You don't get it, do you? This town doesn't want your version of justice. They want order. And I've been the one keeping it together while you sit up here playing the hero. Jordan's patience was wearing thin, but he refused to let Brent bait him. Keeping order. By intimidating civilians. By falsifying reports. That's not order, Brent. That's chaos disguised as authority. Brent's face twisted with anger, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're so righteous, don't you? But when it comes down to it, you're just another politician in a uniform. You don't have the guts to do what needs to be done. Jordan didn't flinch. What needs to be done is holding you accountable. And whether you like it or not, that's exactly what's going to happen. The two men stared each other down, the silence between them crackling with tension. Finally, Brent broke the stare, letting out a bitter laugh as he turned away. You've got no idea what you're up against, he said, his tone venomous. You think you can clean up this town? Good luck. It'll eat you alive. Jordan watched as Brent stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the station, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. Jordan took a deep breath, steadying himself before stepping out into the hallway. Marcus, he called, his voice calm but firm. Marcus appeared immediately, his expression tense. Keep an eye on Brent. Don't let him leave the station without my approval. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. You think he's going to do something stupid? I think he's desperate, Jordan replied. And desperate men make dangerous choices. As the night wore on, the station settled into an uneasy quiet. Logan continued his investigation, combing through files and conducting interviews, while Jordan remained in his office, preparing for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. But just when things seemed to calm, chaos erupted. The blare of the fire alarm shattered the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of shouting. Jordan and Marcus rushed out of the office, their hearts pounding as they tried to make sense of the commotion. In the parking lot, Brent stood beside his patrol car, his face twisted with rage. A crowd of officers and civilians had gathered, their expressions a mix of shock and confusion. In his hand, Brent held a set of papers, evidence from Logan's investigation. "You want to ruin me?" Brent shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Go ahead. But you're going down with me, Hayes." Jordan stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Brent, put the papers down. Let's talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Brent yelled. "You've already made up your mind about me. You think you're better than me? You're not." Jordan held his hands up, his movements slow and deliberate. "This isn't the way, Brent. You've made mistakes, but we can fix this. Together." Brent's grip on the papers tightened, his eyes wild with desperation. "It's too late for that. You wanted a fight, Hayes. Well, here it is." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the two men faced off, the weight of their history and the choices they'd made bearing down on them. And as the tension reached its breaking point, everyone knew, whatever happened next would change Milbrook forever. The parking lot was eerily silent after Brent's outburst. The crowd of officers and onlookers stood frozen, caught in a web of tension so thick it felt suffocating. Jordan held his ground, his gaze locked on Brent, who was now pacing erratically near his patrol car, gripping the stack of evidence like a lifeline. The sheriff's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy radiating from Brent, and every word he spoke was deliberate, meant to diffuse rather than ignite. "Brent," Jordan began, his voice steady but firm, "you've got nothing to prove here. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about doing the right thing." Brent let out a bitter laugh, his movements sharp and frantic. "The right thing? Don't lecture me about the right thing, Hayes. You think this town is going to change because of you? You're dreaming." As Brent's voice echoed across the lot, Marcus stepped closer to Jordan, his expression filled with concern. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "we need to bring this under control. Now." Jordan raised a hand, signaling Marcus to stand down. "Let me handle this," he said softly before turning his full attention back to Brent. "You've got a choice, Brent," Jordan said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and compassion. "You can keep fighting, making this worse for yourself and everyone around you. Or you can stop. Right now. Hand over the papers and let us figure this out together." For a brief moment, something flickered in Brent's eyes, a shadow of doubt, perhaps, or a glimmer of clarity. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the hardened mask of a man cornered by his own actions. "No," Brent snapped, shaking his head. "I've spent too long protecting this place to let you tear it apart. If anyone's going down, it's you." The crowd murmured in confusion and unease. Officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to proceed. Logan stood at the edge of the gathering, his sharp gaze never leaving Brent, his expression unreadable. Jordan took a step closer, his hand still raised in a gesture of calm. "Brent, listen to me. This doesn't have to end like this. You're better than this." But Brent wasn't listening. His breathing grew heavier, his grip on the papers tightening. "You don't get it, Hayes. You've already ruined everything. My career, my reputation, what's left for me? Nothing." "Then let's rebuild it," Jordan said, his voice softer now. "We can fix what's broken. But it starts with you taking responsibility." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Brent stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping slightly. For a moment, it seemed like he might relent. But then his gaze hardened, and he threw the stack of papers into the air. The pages scattered, carried by the wind, as gasps rippled through the crowd. "There's your damn evidence," Brent shouted. "Go ahead, use it against me. See if it changes anything." Jordan moved quickly, motioning for Marcus to collect the papers. He kept his focus on Brent, who now stood motionless, his chest heaving with the weight of his anger and despair. "Brent," Jordan said quietly, "it's over." The words were simple, but their impact was profound. Brent's face twisted in a mixture of rage and resignation, and for a moment, he looked as though he might lash out. But then, slowly, his shoulders sagged, and he lowered his head. "Fine," Brent muttered, his voice barely audible. "You win." The tension in the parking lot began to dissipate as officers moved in to take Brent into custody. Jordan watched in silence as they escorted him away, his mind racing with the implications of what had just unfolded. Back inside the station, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Logan was meticulously piecing together the scattered evidence, while Marcus worked on organizing statements from the officers and witnesses present. Jordan sat at his desk, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The knock on his door was soft but firm. Logan stepped inside, holding a folder in his hands. "Sheriff," he said, his tone professional but tinged with a hint of respect. "We've got everything we need. This case is airtight." Jordan nodded, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" Logan set the folder on the desk and crossed his arms. "Internal Affairs will handle the rest. Callahan will face disciplinary action, likely lose his badge. But the question is, what do you want to do about the bigger picture?" Jordan leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "The bigger picture?" Logan nodded. "This department has issues, Sheriff. Deep ones. Brent's actions are just a symptom of a larger problem. You've got a chance to make real change here, but it won't be easy." Jordan sighed, the weight of the truth settling over him. Change never is. As the hours ticked by, the station slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Brent's arrest had sent shockwaves through the department and the community, sparking heated debates and difficult conversations. But beneath the chaos, there was a sense of hope, a belief that perhaps, for the first time, things could be different. Later that evening, as Jordan locked up his office, he found Marcus waiting for him by the front desk. "Heading out?" Marcus asked, his tone casual but warm. "Yeah," Jordan replied, grabbing his coat. "It's been a long day." Marcus hesitated, then said, "You did the right thing, Sheriff. Not just today, but all along. People are starting to see that." Jordan offered a small smile, the first hint of relief he'd felt all day. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot." As he stepped out into the cool night air, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. The fight wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. And as the stars lit up the sky above Milbrook, Jordan knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road worth traveling. The air in the station was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that comes after a storm. Brent was gone, escorted out by Internal Affairs, but the aftermath of his actions lingered in every corner. Officers moved quietly, their eyes avoiding one another. It wasn't just about Brent anymore, it was about the cracks in the foundation that he had exposed. Jordan stood by the window in his office, staring out at the empty parking lot. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, a reminder of how much had changed in a single day. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. Marcus stepped in, his face a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Sheriff, I think you should see this." Jordan turned, his brow furrowed as Marcus handed him a tablet. On the screen was a video, grainy but clear enough to recognize the voices. It was a recording of Brent during an arrest several months ago, his tone dripping with the same arrogance and hostility that had defined him. "This just came in from someone in the community," Marcus explained. "They said they've been sitting on it, too afraid to come forward until now." Jordan's jaw tightened as he watched the video. Brent's voice was sharp, cutting through the audio like a knife. The way he spoke to the young man in the footage was infuriating, belittling him, accusing him without evidence. Jordan paused the video and set the tablet down. "There's more, isn't there?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "A lot more. Logan's already compiling it. Complaints, testimonies, recordings. It's bad, Sheriff." Jordan sat down heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face. "This isn't just about Brent. This is about the culture that allowed him to thrive." Marcus sat across from him, his voice low but insistent. "You've been trying to change that culture since the day you took over. Maybe this is the turning point we've been waiting for." Jordan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "A turning point, sure. But at what cost?" The room fell into a heavy silence, both men lost in thought. Finally, Marcus broke it. "The community needs to hear from you, Jordan. They need to know what's happening, and they need to believe that things are going to get better." Jordan nodded slowly, the weight of the truth settling over him. "Call a meeting. Town hall. Tomorrow night." Marcus hesitated, then stood. "I'll make the arrangements." After Marcus left, Jordan stayed in his office, the quiet pressing in around him. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, every decision, every word. There was no denying the damage Brent had done, but now it was up to him to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The next evening, the town hall was packed. The tension in the air was palpable as community members filled every seat, their voices hushed but filled with emotion. Jordan stood at the front of the room, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but resolute. Marcus stood off to the side, along with a few other trusted officers. Logan was there too, observing from the back. When the murmurs finally quieted, Jordan stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of the truth. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I won't waste your time with formalities, because I know you're here for answers. You've seen the videos. You've heard the stories. And I won't stand here and pretend that what's been exposed isn't deeply troubling." The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "What happened with Officer Callahan is unacceptable," Jordan continued. "Not just because of his actions, but because those actions were allowed to go unchecked for so long. As sheriff, I take full responsibility for addressing this. And I promise you, this department will not tolerate abuse of power in any form." A hand shot up in the crowd. It was a young man, his face tense but determined. "Sheriff Hayes, how do we know this isn't just talk? We've heard promises before. What's going to change this time?" Jordan met the man's gaze, his voice steady. "You're right to ask that. Words mean nothing without action. That's why we're implementing a full review of all officer conduct, past and present. We'll also be instituting mandatory training on racial bias and accountability, and creating a community oversight board to ensure transparency." The man nodded slowly, his expression softening. But another voice called out, this one older, rougher. "What about Callahan? He's not the only one. There's others like him." Jordan didn't flinch. "If there are others, we'll find them. And they'll be held accountable, just as Brent Callahan has been." The room erupted into murmurs again, some skeptical, others hopeful. Jordan raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. "I know trust doesn't come easy," he said. "And I don't expect you to trust me overnight. But I ask for your patience as we work to fix what's broken. This isn't just my responsibility, it's ours, as a community." As the meeting continued, people began to share their stories, some heartbreaking, others infuriating. Jordan listened to each one, his resolve strengthening with every word. By the time the meeting ended, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. Later that night, back at the station, Jordan sat with Marcus and Logan, reviewing the next steps. The evidence against Brent had grown even stronger, and Logan assured them that the investigation would lead to systemic changes. "Today was a start," Marcus said, his voice tired but hopeful. "People are starting to believe in us again." Jordan nodded, though he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. "A start," he agreed. "But we have a lot of work to do." As the clock ticked past midnight, Jordan finally left the station, the cool night air a welcome relief. He stood in the empty parking lot for a moment, looking up at the stars. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. And that was enough to keep him going. The months following Brent Callahan's removal from the Milbrook Police Department marked a seismic shift in the community. The investigation led by Internal Affairs revealed a pattern of misconduct that reached further than anyone initially suspected. Several officers implicated in Brent's abuse of power resigned under pressure, while others faced formal charges. For many in the town, it was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also a necessary step toward healing. Jordan Hayes remained at the center of the storm, a steady hand guiding his department through its most turbulent period. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the fractured trust between law enforcement and the community, attending every meeting, addressing every concern, and ensuring that no voice went unheard. One afternoon, months after the events that had rocked Milbrook, Jordan sat in his office reviewing proposals for the newly formed Community Oversight Board. The board was a direct result of the promises he had made during the town hall, a diverse group of citizens tasked with reviewing police practices and holding officers accountable. It was a groundbreaking move for a town like Milbrook, and it was already making waves. As he flipped through the pages, there was a knock at the door. Marcus stepped in, his face brighter than Jordan had seen in weeks. "You've got a visitor," Marcus said with a grin. "I think you'll want to take this one." Jordan looked up, intrigued, as Marcus stepped aside to reveal a familiar face. It was the young man from the town hall, the one who had challenged Jordan about his promises. He looked more relaxed now, his posture less defensive. "Sheriff Hayes," the man said, stepping into the office. "I wanted to say thank you." Jordan stood, shaking his hand. "For what?" "For keeping your word," the man replied. "The changes you've made, they matter. People are starting to feel safe again. And that's because of you." Jordan felt a swell of pride, though he kept his expression humble. "It's not just me. This is a team effort, everyone's playing a part." The young man nodded, his smile genuine. "Well, you should know that it's working. People believe in you." After the man left, Jordan sat back down, the weight of his work feeling a little lighter. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to reflect, but in that moment, he let himself feel the magnitude of what they had accomplished. There was still so much to do, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. As for Brent Callahan, his fall from grace was as swift as it was public. Stripped of his badge and facing multiple lawsuits, Brent retreated from Milbrook entirely. Rumors swirled about where he had gone. Some said he moved to a small town out west, others claimed he was working construction under a different name. Wherever he was, he had become a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when power is abused and accountability comes knocking. Logan, the Internal Affairs detective, completed his investigation and presented a detailed report to the town council. His findings not only led to sweeping reforms within the Milbrook Police Department but also served as a blueprint for neighboring towns grappling with similar issues. Before leaving Milbrook, Logan met with Jordan one last time. "You're the kind of leader this town needs," Logan said, shaking Jordan's hand firmly. "Don't let up." Jordan nodded. "I won't." Meanwhile, Marcus, who had been Jordan's steadfast ally throughout the ordeal, received a promotion to deputy chief. His loyalty and dedication had not gone unnoticed, and his new role allowed him to work even closer with Jordan to implement the changes they both believed in. The Community Oversight Board held its first meeting in the newly renovated town hall. Jordan sat in the audience, watching as citizens from all walks of life debated policies, reviewed cases, and proposed new initiatives. It was democracy in action, and it was exactly what he had envisioned. One of the most moving moments came when a local pastor stood to address the board. He spoke about his own experiences with police discrimination and how, for the first time in decades, he felt hope. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," he said. "It's about building something better." Jordan felt the words resonate deeply within him. This was the legacy he wanted to leave, not just for himself, but for Milbrook and the generations to come. On a quiet evening, Jordan found himself back at the community center, the place where he had first started as a volunteer officer years ago. The center was bustling with activity, kids playing basketball, parents chatting on the sidelines, and a group of teenagers working on a mural. The mural depicted scenes of Milbrook's history, including a powerful image of Jordan standing in front of the town hall, his badge shining brightly. "Looks good, doesn't it?" a voice said behind him. Jordan turned to see Marcus, a basketball under his arm and a grin on his face. "It does," Jordan replied, smiling. "You've come a long way," Marcus said, tossing him the ball. "But I think you've still got a few more plays left in you." Jordan caught the ball, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "I hope so." They spent the next hour shooting hoops with the kids, laughter and shouts echoing through the gym. For Jordan, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about power or authority, it was about service, about making a difference. As the night wore on and the gym emptied, Jordan walked out into the cool night air. He looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead would still be challenging, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. This story is a powerful reminder that change is possible, but it requires courage, accountability, and unwavering determination. Jordan Hayes' journey shows us that leadership isn't about wielding power, it's about serving others, even when the path is difficult. It's about making choices that reflect integrity and standing up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. What about you? How do you think accountability should be enforced in our communities? What does leadership mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more narratives like this, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that notification bell. Together, we can continue exploring stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer to understanding one another. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.